Okay, so welcome back, everybody, to our final segment of today's Peoples and Power workshop. We're in sort of the home stretch now, and our first presenter of this part is a speaker I'm sure many of you know very well. So Michael David Ethington, formerly of Padua, now of our EX-PATRIA project, who is our all-around Syriac expert on the project and producer of a great deal of our maps and of these wonderful graphic posters that you've been seeing advertised all over. And you'll be seeing parts of in this presentation as well. And Michael will be studying captives in this 5th century period, as Katja introduced, and will today be talking around this title of merchants, craftsmen, bishops, and apostates, Christian identities in Persia, and the perception of captivity surrounding the conflict of 421. So without further ado, I pass it over to Michael. Take it away, please.
Thank you very much, Dan. So my goal with this presentation is to show the first steps of my project, which I just recently started here in Lille, and basically go through the period prior to the war of 421 and see how this period prior to the war influences then the situation of the Christians in and around the conflict of 421. And I'll also take into consideration 2 specific case studies, because there are many small cases to be taken into consideration, and for this occasion I had to be selective and present to you only a couple of elements. So first and foremost, starting from the antebellum, so the period prior to the war, and talking about merchants, craftsmen, and their relation with politics, I take into consideration for the antebellum period more or less the decade from the Synod of Marisac, so for about 410, until, of course, the outbreak of the war in 421. And concerning merchants and craftsmen, we see, also thanks to, again, the work of Jeffrey Greatrix and Dieu, this treaty of 409, which concerns border crossing merchants and the risk of espionage on both sides. So basically, this treaty blocks the mobility of merchants between the 2 powers to 3 centers, which we see here: Artashat in Armenia, Nisibis in Persian territory again, and Kalinicum in the Roman territory. So there appears to be worry of spies in this period, also of good relations between the 2 empires. So it's quite relevant. And the second element is concerning, again, trade, the involvement at least of one agent of the Church of the East, which has already been mentioned by other scholars, that of Catholicos Achai, who was sent by King Yazdegerd to inspect trade in Fars, basically the Christian Arabic sources from which we know of this episode mention of potentially lost cargo from eastern areas. It generically talks about India and China in other terms. And the King of Kings fears that the local governor of Fars had taken the goods for himself and putting blame on piracy. And so he sent what he would have probably considered an external agent to deal with this trading debacle in Fars. And another element to be taken into consideration, which is the more nebulous part, is the part of concerning craftsmen, because we know that there were gold mines in Armenia, and they become quite relevant, for example, in the treaties and in the context of conflicts in the 6th century. And for example, here I placed a passage of Hazar Parapetsi, where he is glorifying in general, propagandistically, plausibly, Armenia, and he talks about miners as quite influential people in this context. So quite an important presence in the Sasanian Empire. And the second element, of course, which is contained in the title, are the bishops and apostates. And in this decade, we see a close collaboration of individuals with the Sasanian power. And we have three known, at least, cases of what I call bishop agents of the Shahanshah. One is the already mentioned Ahai, which I named the trade inspector, so to say. And then we have Yabalaha, who has already been mentioned, who held then the Synod of 420, who was sent previously to Constantinople as an envoy of the Shahanshah, and he had close ties with the King of Kings. And finally, a quite curious character, this Bishop Samuel, who is mentioned again by some of these Christian Arabic sources and has been quite ignored by scholars apart from very early 19th and early 20th century literature. This Samuel is quite relevant because in two of these Christian Arabic sources, he is responsible for influencing the election of Dadisho to the Catholicosate because he had favor with Wahram. Why? One of these sources doesn't mention the reason, but the other source talks about him protecting the border quite explicitly from enemy attacks, which could have gone into Persia, which is quite fascinating. And this bishop is mentioned as the Bishop of Tus. This is probably a later attribution of what was at the time actually the see of Abarshar, which we find in the synods from the earliest synods. Even though this Samuel is not present, he probably held the see not during Yabalaha's term and not even in the synod of Dadishon, perhaps in the middle, and he was influential for this reason for nominating the Catholicos. So we have very personal connections which influence power in the empire and actions within the empire. And of course, this collaboration is quite dangerous for the Christian community, apart from bringing advantages of political influence. And I want to concentrate on a specific relation between these Christian communities in the late 410s and early 420s, and a specific figure in the Sasanian court, that is Mir Shapur, who is the Argbeg. As mentioned also in the Synod of Isaac, he is one of the authorities present along the King of Kings. But there appears in these Christian Arabic sources, and also in Elias of Nisibis, who writes both in Syriac and Arabic, a commander of the army, either Sahib Jaish or Rab Khayla in respectively Arabic and Syriac, which is unnamed in the Christian Arabic sources, but is named in Elias of Nisibis as Mir Shapur. And in this context, this Mir Shapur is quite important in the election of the Catholicos. We see here after the death of Yabalaha, as we have recalled, the faithful chose him, that is, his mana and mass, and beseeched the commander of the army of Yazdegerd to intercede with the king in his favor. And this is Amr ibn Mata al-Tirkhani. Then we see the Chronicle of Sart. It gives a similar, even the Chronicle of Sart mentions his name. The Christians requested of the intervention of Mir Shapur, the commander of the army, before Yazdegerd. To achieve this goal, they offered him a sum of money. And this happens again with Mana's successor. Mana is quite an unlucky patriarch, Catholicos, because he is deposed quite quickly, and he is replaced by this figure named Farrokh Bogt, bishop of Bishapur. After the death of Catholicos Mana, interestingly, they say the death of Catholicos Mana, not his deposition. Farrokh Bogt, sought the help of the commander of the army of Wahram for the Catholicosate, giving him money. Again, corruption. And instead, in Saliba in Yuhanna, Farrokh Bogt was associated with the commander of the army of Wahram Gur, the son of Yazdegerd. He was serving him and getting close to his heart. So he helped and forced the fathers with violence to make him patriarch. And finally, Elias of Nisibis, against Farrokh Bogt sought refuge with the commander of the army, was made Catholicos by force. And again, Saliba ibn Yuhanna, we see again that the interplay with the authorities of the Sasanian court that the Sasanian court is not unified against the Christians or with the Christians. It's quite an interpersonal affair. We see that Farah was clearly not quite popular among some of the East Syriac Christians. And the passage says, the fathers, believers, and leaders of Al-Madain, that is Seleucid Ctesiphon, gathered and resorted to the king and the vizier, that is probably the Wuzur Famadar, to eliminate him, that is Farah Vogt, deposing him and exiling him to his city. So there is a quite complex relation of power in this period, just prior to the outbreak of the conflict. And of course, with this close collaboration, there is the issue of trust. As the fifth column has already been mentioned, and here I place some of the more traditional mentions of mistrust containing hagiographies, where Syriac sources portray portray this perceived risk of appearing as traitors to the Persians. We have, for example, Mir Shapur to Wahram in the Martin of Peroz. The Nazarenes, that is, the Christians, have rebelled against you, or they transgress your commandment and despise your kingdom, or have embraced rebellion. So these clear statements of rebellion. But on the other hand, it's not just mistrust from the Persians, it is also an attention by Christians themselves. An example is from a martyr act of the so-called Jacob the Notary, where he is described as bringing in secret words that he would hear from the king, who was a notary at the court of the Shahanshah. So internal espionage at the court, and we could potentially say, well, that was probably the actual reason he was killed and not Christianity itself, for example. But I will talk about Jacob the Notary soon enough. Now, finally, we switch to the actual outbreak of the war. The main sources we have, of course, the main sources, of course, Socrates Scholasticus, with variants found in Syriac in Michael the Syrian and Barabraya, that is, sources from the 12th to 13th century. What is interesting is that we see three main factors of the war. One is persecution and mobility of Christians to the Roman Empire, which has already been mentioned, but also two other reasons. Merchants and their goods being seized by the Persians, and gold miners who apparently were Romans and were hired by the Persians and were not being handed back. It's interesting how the Syriac sources would have some translation of Socrates Scholasticus transformed the word Roman into Christian, which is also fascinating in the construction of identity itself. And so we see this, the outbreak of the conflict, and now we can look at the bigger picture, who were the captives and the displaced people in general surrounding this conflict. On one side, we have the Romans, and this, the Roman side basically only involves the actual military conflict. So we have captives from military actions, these 7,000 or so inhabitants of Ardanene in northern Mesopotamia, of which is the other case study I will take into consideration. And on the Persian side, we have numerous individual cases. So we have these three Catholicoses. Mana, the first, he's exiled to Fars, but he still continues to act as a Catholicos in exile, and is quickly imprisoned, and anathema is imposed by the will of the King of Kings on him. So he imposes the bishops to act on this anathema. And then Farah Vogt, who is elected in this very shady way as well, and is exiled to Fars. And then Dadisho was brought up by an influential bishop who potentially has died, and then this favor drops and the war also starts. And he is then imprisoned. Apparently then he's freed through the treaties, and he's then goes into self-exile, and in the Synod of 424, he is reinstated into power. Then we have major and minor ecclesiastical figures which appear in martyr acts, and again in martyr acts, these Christian members of the royal court, like the notary, and the Iranian aristocracy that have apparently converted to Christianity, who were sympathizing with Christians. And finally, these very mysterious gold miners and artisans and merchants, of which I won't deal too much with because it's quite complicated to work with these figures, and there aren't any sources like the Syriac sources that deal with these characters. These gold miners and art and merchants are only echoing basically Sophocles, Scholasticus. There's no care in East Syriac sources for this element. It's only about relations between the ecclesiastical figures, the aristocracy, and power. So, jumping to the case study number 1. So, Jacob the Notary, already mentioned, he's contained in the Actam Martyrum et Sanctorum, volume 4. And actually, his identity is not quite clear because the Syriac text kind of alternates between notara, which means notary, and is also a role we find in the Synodicon Orientale. The notary writes down what is said in the synod, and or natora, so the guard. So it's quite unclear which of the two actually is, according to the Syriac text. But what is clear is that he is an informant for the bishops in this context, at least according to the hagiography. It's a quite problematic text because it has many Greek words. For example, Mirshapur is mentioned, and Mirshapur is actually a complex figure in the persecution because we have also a chief of the Magi named Mirshapur in other martyr acts. But here we have Heuparcha, so the Hipparchos in Greek, which has been argued by other scholars that this Hipparchos is actually corresponding to the Arbed, and which would actually make sense with the influence that Mirshapur had just a couple of years prior, before the war, and also because of the high employment of soldiers by this Mirshapur and the narrative in the hagiography itself. So what happens to this Jacob and his captivity? Basically, his properties are seized, which is an apparently quite common behavior by the Sasanian authorities, especially with converts, and we have sources after, like post-Sasanian sources, regarding the seizing of properties to apostates in that case. And before being actually executed, him and other 15 notaries or guards are condemned to attending the king's elephants, quite a picturesque element. But what is fascinating is the maintenance of the king's road, Urcha the Malka, as mentioned in the text, towards Balashvar, so towards the mountainous region which leads to Mount Bisutun and then afterwards to Hamadan. And what is interesting is that this region is actually linked to captivity in other sources. We have, it has been mentioned before this morning with the Daniel stuff, if I remember correctly, in the Synod of Dadisho, we have a bishopric named of the captivity, Dashwita, of Balashvar, so just a couple of years after. And in another martyrdom, that of the Acts of Pathion, Adurormizd and Anohid, which is set in 446 under Yazdegerd II, the clergy that gathers the bodies of Anahid and Pathion are the clergy of the Bnai Shedia, so the sons of captivity or the captives or the descendants of captives. So there appears to be a general memory of usage of people for potentially forced labor or something in this region in general. At least the pattern seems like this. And we already mentioned, for example, the captivity of Gorgan, which is the other bishopric at this time with containing captives, which could correspond with the developing of fortifications and also the interest of the church in this area as well, with Samuel, as mentioned before. And then what is quite fascinating and complex is Jacob's Roman identity and how this plays into the text and also the tradition and the perception of captivity. At the beginning of the text, the text states that Jacob was from the city called Karcha de Adsa, with this vocalization in Bejan's edition, which could lead us to Edessa, but it's quite strange. Well, it could be explained with this text is translated from Greek and it's talking of Edessa, but it's quite strange because the only occurrence, at least according to a search on Syntho, for example, Karcha de Adsa, it's only in the Martyrdom of Charbel, and it's a completely different context. And it's Edessa in a quite early period, Edessa of the Parthians, and it's quite a different thing. So it's hardly identifiable from this definition. So I kind of disagree with this position. But it's fascinating how this Romanness is part of his virtue. He was truthful and firm in his faith because his family, Gens, was of the Romans. And how can we locate and understand this Romanness of Jacob? Well, the Martyr Act describes the voyage that his body receives after death. And after a few days, they placed him, that is Jacob's body, on a boat and brought him through the Tigris, the Eklat, to his city. And we have a scene with the saint's mother and the bishop of Karka, who's named Saumai. And we actually have a bishop named Saumai in the Synod of Yabalaha, who is the bishop of Karka. So it appears that there is a base of historical background of this hagiography with multiple layers, probably potentially also passing through Greek and then going back. I cannot argue this here. But this Karka is probably, according to scholars, and also if we see that the bishoprics present in the Synod of Yabalaha are mostly metropolitan sees and the sees of Khuzestan, is Karka Beledan, or in the Iranian terminology, Eran Shar Shapur. So basically, what does Jacob's Romanness have to do with Karka Beledan? This is probably related to memory of the deportations of the 4th century by Shapur II, who used deportees from his triumph against the Romans to build his urbanistic projects in the Khuzestan or Beth Uzaye in Syria. So this is probably, at least in my opinion, the relation of Romanness and captivity. So there is memory, and there is this also element of the 5th column in the end that also returns in this sense. And now we move to the second case study. Sorry for the huge wall of text here, but it's not relevant to read everything. But I just present to you the 4 main sources that deal with these 7,000 military captives. Of course, the number 7,000 is quite arbitrary, as many sources of mass captives. For example, the Chronicle of Zuknin, which kind of echoes Socrates, talks about 10,000 families, which is quite weird. But basically, the captives appear to be from Arzanen, but it's not quite clear what these captives are, because Socrates shows these 7,000 captives being taken, and the bishop of Amida, Acacius, who was quite influential in the previous decade with diplomatic missions between Rome and the Sasanian Empire, freeing them and paying a ransom to free them personally as a personal gesture. But I think that Socrates is hiding something from us, basically. And here I summarize the sources. So what the other 2 means, because Michael the Seer mostly echoes quite literally Socrates, but the Chronicle of Zuknin and the Amr ibn Matal Tirkhani report different elements. So the Chronicle of Zuknin says the army captured Persian Arzon and it belonged to Amid, which is quite strange. So it appears that it's, and also, they also mention he also ransomed the rest of the nobility, so not just local population. There appears to be an aristocratic element to it. And on the other hand, Amr ibn Matal Tirkhani talks about not Arzanen, but Ba'arabaya and Jazira, so just northern Mesopotamia in general, which is, of course, with Arzanen, the main theater of the war, of course. So the prisoners in general are from this area. But it's interesting that he also includes their bishops, which is probably, I don't know, I think that's more of an interest of the source itself with the ecclesiastical element in that case. But, and also Amr ibn Matal Tirkhani makes a chronological mistake locating this ransom in under the Catholic set of Isaac, so 10 years prior. It's a mistake on his part. But the Chronicle of Zuknin is quite fascinating because it appears that this is not simply a personal ransoming of captives, but also a political statement while Arzon was occupied, Amid kind of claims authority over the population in a sense, like with this statement of it belonged to Amid, at least according to the Chronicle of Zuknin. And this also seems to contain a wider element of the peace treaty in general, and not just a pious gesture, which of course is part of it, but we know that Akakius was part of the peace negotiations of 422. So this kind of hints to us the general background of the peace treaty. And so to end this presentation, some final remarks. What we can see here is that the Syriac Church is in a process of developing of its own institution, and the attempts at institutionalization within the Sasanian Empire need to be understood not on just grounds of fitting into the Sasanian structures, but mostly on the personal networks, which I think is quite. We don't need to say necessarily, yeah, okay. At this point, the Syriac Church starts to basically become symbiotic with the Sasanian administration, but personal preferences lead people to be involved in the Sasanian administration here and there, while in other places people are persecuted. And so the situation is far more complex than potential traditional perspectives on Yazdegerd, the end of Yazdegerd and Wahram's reign are just persecution against the Christians, or the other part where it's just a matter of politics. It's part of a mixture of personal relationship, politics, ideology, irrationality, which I think is an important actor in all of this as well. And also in the perception of captivity, we see the memory of previous experiences, the whole matter of Shapur II and his depredations of the 4th century, which is something that lingers. And in this decade prior to the war, we have the collection of the memory of all of this with Marutha, and also Achai is mentioned in this in Arabic sources as using this mission in Fars as an expedient to collect stories of the martyrs in that area. So this is a period of memory construction, basically, and it's quite important. And also finally, an element that can help us better understand the Sasanian infrastructure projects in this period and how these triangulate with this wider context and involvement of Christians in the Sasanian infrastructure projects over time. And this is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for that, Michael. Fascinating as always. To start with, do we have any questions from the room? Well, I'm going to check the chat, but first I want to give people in the room a chance if they have anything.
No, many thanks, Michael. It was great, and I think this is a study that has never been done. Considered so. Everything new. Yeah, it's everything new for what I heard. So many thanks. In particular, the usage of the Arabic sources of the 10th, 11th century is crucial in this sense because they are the only source we have.
Yes, exactly. And then of course they take a lot, like they are late, but they take a lot from previous Iranian tradition, from Syriac texts that have been lost. And for example, the Chronicle of Zuknin takes Socrates Scholasticus, but as the Germans would say, it's Zwischenquellen, so to say. So in between, something in between that influences their narrative as well.
Yeah, also because now in the last 8 years, all these Arabic sources have been finally edited and translated all in Italian by Gianmaria Zanazza, that made an impressive work. So now we can access really these texts because since 20 years before now, all these texts were mixed in a mess. So not usable. Now they are really usable, so they will change a lot. I really agree with your idea of irrationality in a sense, because the last thing you were saying about the collection of martyr history, so the memory building, memory construction.
I'll just put this as a reference to that. I just trust in irrationality. But the mission of Acha here.
The inspector, because it is true that in the chronicle you really have like, since it was sent there for as
that
an ambassador,
yeah.
he was there, and so he saw the martyr's case, and so say, okay, I can collect these stories.
Mhm.
So it is randomly in a sense. So since he was there,
Yeah.
because of other stuff, he started building this
Yeah,
collection.
and fits, of course, with the cultural environment of the time.
Precisely, but in a sense was not a plan of the Catholics.
Yeah, no.
To collect the memory. Since, if we believe the text.
If we believe the text, of course.
So it is really interesting because we tend to think about like, yeah, the Persian martyrs were a well-organized memory in the church of this, blah, blah, blah. But still, if you read the text, it seems that he was there in Persia, so he saw the situation, and so he decided to start this first possible core of Persian martyr acts at the beginning of the 5th century. Then we know the situation of Persian martyr acts is really complex from a philological point of view. But it's really fascinating. Also, this approach of really like possible random and personal and irrational stuff that were happening in that period, and that create a lot of
chance.
Yeah,
in that sense. And also, I think, of course, chance driven partially by this identity building that was now starting seriously. Like we have now a church that is trying to define its borders, its boundaries, its limits and its influence. And this is part of it, of course. And it's all a matter of the connections, maybe like Achai is as influence in Fars, but for example, other people like Fars seems to be quite important. This Birmana was from Fars, and Persian. Farokht was from Fars, for example. So a lot of people are related to the region, and this also seems to be the connection, like personally being from there.
Yeah, I was thinking also like.
Can I maybe, because I feel that this could go on a long time, and it's really good, but we have other questions, and I'm sure I'd just like to give other people a chance to. So we have a question in the chat from Patrick, who asks about your reading of Hipparch, and says Hipparch or Hipparchos. He says in the latter case that would be the equivalent of the aspect, the Magister Equitum, and he was wondering, since Hipparchos seems to translate to spar-bed, which might be synonymous with ard-bed, could you elaborate why this form of translation is what we thought was more convincing?
Well, there is an article 2023 by, I don't remember her name, Polish scholar Katarzyna or something.
Katarzyna Maksymik,
who wrote about different positions in the Sasanian Empire and argued on the specific case of Hipparcha in this light itself, and connected him with Mir Shapur. And I was already thinking about it. I found the article and I was like, I see this connection. And of course, the correspondence also is between the various sources from the Synodicon Orientale, and then through the Christian Arabic sources, which mention the Mir Shapur, or the commander of the army. And so this correspondence in itself, I'm not quite knowledgeable of all of the Sasanian core positions, but this is what I'm basically basing my arguments on. And mostly the correspondence between the various sources, like whatever the proper title is, it's evident, at least to me, that the person is the same, at least in this case.
Okay, thank you for that. I hope that answers the question. So do we have any other questions? Anyone, anything burning they'd like to ask?
Just as, I mean, it's sort of fitting in with what Richard Payne is arguing about the integration, isn't it, of, if you like, the perils of Christianity becoming sort of being officialized by Yazdgard. With that come both opportunities and risks. And that's exactly, so they're implicated in court politics, and therefore they come under suspicion, and those rivalries become ever more intense, which of course actually happens in the Roman Empire as well. The stakes are higher. So the consequences for failure, and you're in the wrong group of courtiers, then.
And also, like, the matter, I think that this factor goes together with beyond the cultural boundary and the religious boundary. I think the interrelation, like the preferences, just potential sympathies themselves. Like a lot of these Christian Arabic sources are quite, they seem to hint to this very emotional link between the Sasanian king and these ecclesiastical figures. And also like personal figures as well, like all of the healing episodes which are famous and are like also literal experience, of course, but we know that Christians were active in medical fields as well. So, and especially later on, also the Sasanian and post-Sasanian periods as well, like Kundishapur and all of the other medical experiences. And so like all of this comes together, like the proper institutional element, the more personal side, like, and this, like it's all intertwined. And I think one should not over focus on the institution, just the institutional risk, but also like the personal element, which sometimes goes beyond the property ideological. I mean, it's quite complicated, and it's also, I think, at least by case basis of the various characters.
Okay.
I have a question, and maybe one of the things we can discuss also later. This theme of the fifth column, it always, I don't know, tortures me a little bit, because it seems isn't it strange within the Syriac historiography, this self-imposed this rhetoric of it, and just the question of it is, to what times do you really date the beginning of this recurrent idea of we are here, we are being connected with the Romans, hence
So chronologically speaking, I don't know at the moment, but there is an interesting argument on the fifth column in an article by Simcha Gross, which is quite good, and I very much agree with
us
him.
to record it.
Yeah,
with him.
I very much agree with him, and that's one of the reasons I made this slide, also being partially inspired by him. The fact that the Syriacs display this because they are because it's also a warning, like to themselves, like we are potentially in danger. It's not just portraying the fears of the Persians, but the fear on the other side of being feared in that sense. In this sense, it portrays something real and not just an ideological.
But for us, historiographically, for us poor historians now, what's real evidence we have for this topic apart from the Syriac historiography and the Greek, like in whatever we might have from Iranian side, we don't meet it because in Greek source, in Greek Roman, whatever sources, I think it's the tendency is to use this topic for justification of different interventions, and it plays very, very well, starting from Eusebius, this theme of us to protect them there, really, and this projection of power. Yeah, I'll have to study what Simcha wrote. Yeah.
The longing.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
That's difficult.
Yes. So we have a couple of minutes left.
And something in the chat.
Something in the chat. Let me check.
If we
Yes, this question of Amir posed the question.
you can actually see.
This seems more of a comment to me. So he asks. He says,
Christians in international aspiring to institutional acceptance is credible considering past decades where Constantine's corresponded with Shapur and put crosshairs on the community. Well, the matter of Constantine's correspondences, a complicated subject.
It might be
1 minute, one.
Yeah.
Yes, it might be interesting to think about, say, the Armenian position.
Yes.
Where they have a sort of tangled connection with Rome, where they look at them as simultaneously a Christian empire, which is good, but eventually these hated Chalcedonians, which is bad. And there's never, even in wars, there isn't much of a understanding that the Armenians belong to the Roman Empire. They don't see themselves that way. And so they might be a useful comparison for this fifth column
Yeah.
question, whether they see themselves as fifth column,
Mhm.
when they do, when they don't.
Armenians are
Well, the
worse than the
Armenians,
fifth column. They
oh,
have
yes.
Mercury.
Yes.
Yeah,
The
because at least-
Armenians
at least,
are born thrown into
At least in the Syrians, you
Persian
have the
Empire.
local communities and of course, all of the deportees from the West, which is
Yeah.
one of the factors also in building this.
Why anyone ever trusted any of these Armenian
Oh,
allies is a question I want to.
Akatopoulos, who commits like treachery, like goes to the other side about 3 or 4 times in his lifetime before eventually being caught and beaten to death in a carpet. Yes.
Yeah.
I guess you just can't get rid of them. Right, well, thank you, Michael. I think we've come to our time and we shall move on, but that was a fantastic talk, and I'm sure we could go on forever if we didn't have Anna to introduce.